The hum of the starship Eclipse was faint, almost imperceptible, as Captain Elara Voss stirred from her cryosleep pod. The air was cold, and the faint glow of emergency lights cast long shadows across the dimly lit chamber. Around her, the rest of the crew remained frozen in their pods, silent and still. She blinked, her mind racing to piece together the last fragments of memory. They had entered cryosleep weeks ago, preparing for a routine journey through deep space. But something had gone wrong. The ship was adrift, its systems flickering erratically, and the view beyond the viewport was unlike anything she had ever seen. A swirling, impenetrable mist stretched endlessly in every direction, its movements almost hypnotic, as if it were alive. The monitors around her displayed strange, pulsating symbols, a language she didn't recognize, yet felt eerily familiar. Elara's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary mist. It felt like the universe itself was watching, waiting, and as she stepped forward to assess the situation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the rules of reality no longer applied here. The stakes were clear: survive, revive her crew, and uncover the truth behind this cosmic enigma. But as the mist pressed closer to the ship, she realized the greatest threat might not be outside the eclipse. It might already be inside. Elara's fingers trembled as she adjusted the cryopod's controls, her breath shallow and uneven. The faint hum of the ship's systems was the only sound in the dimly lit medbay, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. Dr. Kale Arvid's vitals flickered on the monitor alive, but barely. The cryopod's malfunction had left him in a fragile state, hovering between consciousness and oblivion. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kale, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, glazed and distant, and his lips moved as if trying to form words. What came out was a chilling murmur, fragmented and urgent. The watchers in the Mista, there waiting. Then, as quickly as he'd surfaced, Kale's eyes closed again, his body sinking back into the cold embrace of the cryopod. Elara stepped back, her mind racing. The words lingered, heavy and ominous. Who or what were the watchers, and what did they want? She glanced at the other pods, each holding a member of her crew, their faces pale and still under the frost. Reviving them now felt like a gamble she couldn't afford to take. Not with Kale's cryptic warning hanging in the air. She had to make a choice: continue trying to wake the others, or uncover the truth about the mist that had swallowed their ship. Her gut told her the answers lay in the mist. If she could understand it, maybe she could save them all. With a deep breath, she turned and made her way to the ship's central console. The Eclipse's logs were her only lead. Her fingers flew across the interface, pulling up the last entries before the mist had enveloped them. The logs revealed a chilling sequence of events. The Eclipse had been drawn to this region of space after detecting an ancient signal, a faint, pulsing beacon that defied all known records. It was unlike anything they'd encountered before, a whisper from the void that seemed to call out to them. The crew had debated the risks, but curiosity had won out. They'd altered course, venturing into uncharted territory, and then the mist. It had appeared without warning, swallowing the ship whole. The final log entry sent a shiver down her spine. Unknown presence detected aboard. Systems failing. Mist it's alive. Elara stared at the screen, her heart pounding. A presence, alive. The words felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She turned her gaze to the viewport, where the mist swirled in an endless dance, thick and impenetrable. It was as if the void itself had taken form, watching, waiting, and then, faintly, she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. Whispers faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the ship's corridors like threads of shadow. Elara clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. Whatever was out there, whatever they were, she would find them, and she would find a way to bring her crew home. Elara tightened her grip on the pulse rifle, its weight grounding her as she moved through the dimly lit corridors of the ship. The whispers grew louder with every step, a haunting chorus that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Her training kicked in, guiding her movements as she methodically swept each section of the vessel. The cargo bay was her next destination, and as she approached, the air grew colder, thick with an otherworldly chill. When she reached the bay, the sight stopped her in her tracks. A jagged breach in the hull revealed the mist pouring in, swirling and coalescing into forms that defied logic. They shifted and pulsed, as if alive, and Elara felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. Before she could react, one of the shapes solidified into a towering humanoid figure, its form shimmering and indistinct, but undeniably menacing. It lunged at her with startling speed, and Elara barely managed to dodge, firing a burst from her rifle that seemed to pass right through it. The figure dissolved back into the mist, but the encounter left her shaken. This was no ordinary phenomenon. The mist was alive, sentient even, and it was watching her. Fighting back a surge of panic, Elara made a quick decision. She sealed off the cargo bay, locking the mist inside, and turned her attention to the ship's navigation systems. If she could get the ship moving again, she might stand a chance. But as she worked, the mist's influence began to seep into the ship's systems. The AI, usually so reliable, flickered and glitched, displaying fragmented messages that made no sense. The sleepers stir, the cycle begins anew. Her hands trembled as she tried to override the malfunctions, but the more she fought, the more the mist seemed to resist. It was as if the ship itself was being consumed from the inside out. Elara's determination flared, a stubborn spark in the face of the unknown, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They tugged at the edges of her mind, planting seeds of doubt and fear. Could she really outwit something so alien, so vast? For a moment, she hesitated, her resolve wavering. But then she straightened, her jaw tightening. She had come too far to let fear take hold. The mist might be powerful, but so was she, and she wasn't going down without a fight. Elara's hands moved swiftly over the ship's control panel, her fingers dancing across the glowing interface as she worked to stabilize the failing systems. The ship's hum, once steady and reassuring, now crackled with instability, a reminder of the mist's relentless interference. She had managed to restore partial power, but the victory was short-lived. A sudden surge of energy rippled through the circuits, and the cryopod controls sparked violently. The display flickered, then went dark. Elara's heart sank as she realized the pods were no longer responding to automated commands. If she didn't act quickly, the crew would remain frozen in time, their bodies suspended but their minds slipping further into the void. With a deep breath, she activated the manual override, her mind racing through the steps she had practiced countless times in simulations. But this was no simulation. Every second counted, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. As she worked, a faint whisper brushed against her thoughts. Kale's voice, calm yet urgent. The mist feeds on fear and doubt, he warned. It thrives where your resolve falters. Elara clenched her jaw, trying to shut out the rising tide of panic. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not now, but the mist had already found its way into her mind. Visions began to surface, unbidden and vivid. She saw herself standing on the bridge of her first command, the faces of her crew twisted in terror as their ship was torn apart by a rogue asteroid field. The memory was sharp, cutting through her concentration like a blade. She had survived that day, but they had not. The guilt she had buried deep within her now surged to the surface, amplified by the mist's malevolent energy. It was as if the mist had found the cracks in her armor and was pouring itself into them, feeding on her pain and regret. For a moment, Elara faltered. Her hands trembled, and the control panel blurred before her eyes. But then she remembered Kale's words. The mist wasn't just an external force, it was a mirror, reflecting her own fears back at her. If she let it take hold, it would consume her entirely. Summoning every ounce of strength, she forced herself to confront the memories. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how it shaped her. One by one, she faced the faces of her lost crew, acknowledging their sacrifice without letting it define her. The visions began to fade, their grip on her mind loosening. But the mist wasn't done. As the hallucinations receded, the air around her grew heavier, the shadows deeper. The ship's lights dimmed further, and a low, resonant hum filled the air, as if the mist itself were alive and watching. Elara knew she was running out of time. The crew's survival depended on her ability to outwit this unseen enemy, and she couldn't afford another misstep. Her focus sharpened, her movements becoming more deliberate. The mist might feed on fear, but it had underestimated her resolve. She was no longer the same person who had failed all those years ago. She was stronger now, forged by loss and tempered by purpose, and she would not let the mist win. Elara took a deep breath, her hand gripping the portable scanner tightly as she stood at the edge of the ship's airlock. The mist loomed before her, swirling like a living thing, its shifting currents whispering with a haunting, almost sentient energy. She knew this was no ordinary fog. It was something far older, far stranger. The ancient signal had drawn her here, and now it was time to answer its call. With a final glance at the tether secured to her belt, she stepped into the void. The moment her boots touched the mist-shrouded expanse, the world around her seemed to dissolve. The mist clung to her suit, its tendrils curling around her limbs as if testing her resolve. Her senses scrambled, sounds echoed from every direction, but none of them were real. She swore she heard her crewmates calling her name, their voices urgent, pleading. "Elara, over here, hurry, we need you." The words were so vivid, so convincing, that for a moment she almost turned toward them, but she clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus on the scanner in her hands. The readings were erratic, but the signal was there, growing stronger with every step. Pushing forward, she fought against the disorientation, her mind sharpening with determination. The mist played tricks, conjuring flashes of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to dart just out of sight. Yet she kept her eyes locked on the scanner, its faint beeps guiding her like a lifeline. And then, through the swirling haze, something emerged. A structure, colossal and ancient, floated silently in the void. Its surface was etched with the same cryptic symbols she'd seen on the ship's monitors, their lines glowing faintly with an eerie, pulsating light. Elara's breath caught in her throat as she approached. The structure wasn't just a relic. It was alive in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. The light emanating from its surface seemed to breathe, shifting in rhythm with the mist itself. It dawned on her then, this wasn't merely an artifact. It was a gateway, and the mist, swirling protectively around it, wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a guardian, a sentinel designed to keep intruders at bay. Her heart raced as she considered the implications. What lay beyond the gateway, and why had it called to her? The questions swirled in her mind, but there was no time to hesitate. The signal was clear now, a steady hum that seemed to resonate deep within her. Whatever secrets this place held, they were waiting for her to uncover them. With cautious steps, Elara moved closer, her scanner buzzing with activity. The symbols on the structure's surface seemed to shift as she approached, as if reacting to her presence. She reached out a gloved hand, hesitating for just a moment before her fingers brushed against the ancient surface. The light flared suddenly, brighter than before, and for a split second, the mist around her seemed to part, revealing a glimpse of something vast and impossibly distant on the other side. Then, just as quickly, the vision was gone, and the mist closed in once more. Elara stood there, her mind racing with possibilities. The gateway was real, and it was active. But to where, or when, did it lead? Elara stepped closer to the towering structure, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast emptiness. The mist around her seemed to pulse, alive with an energy she couldn't quite grasp. Then, without warning, it shifted, swirling and condensing into a massive figure that loomed before her. Its form was fluid, ever-changing, as though it were made of the very fabric of the cosmos. A voice emerged, deep and resonant, yet layered with countless others, as if it carried the whispers of every soul that had ever passed through this place. "Why have you come?" it demanded, the question reverberating through the air and into her very bones. For a moment, Elara faltered, the weight of the question pressing down on her. But then she straightened, her resolve firming. "I've come to save my crew," she said, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her chest. "I need to find a way to return us home." The figure regarded her silently, its luminous gaze piercing. "The gateway you seek is not meant for mortals," it intoned, its voice a mixture of warning and sorrow. "To pass through is to risk becoming one with the mist, to lose yourself in the endless void. You must choose, leave now, forget all you have seen, or step forward and face the consequences." Elara's breath caught. The choice was stark, the stakes unimaginable. She thought of her crew, stranded and vulnerable, relying on her to find a way back. Yet, the thought of losing herself to the mist, of vanishing into that endless expanse, sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded as she weighed her duty against her fear, the silence stretching around her like a chasm. Finally, she took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing within her. She had come too far to turn back now. "I'll enter," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of uncertainty. "I have to know what lies beyond." The figure seemed to nod, its form dissolving into the mist once more. As it faded, the air before her shimmered, and the gateway opened. A swirling vortex of light and shadow appeared, its edges rippling like water. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a portal to the unknown that seemed to hum with a power beyond comprehension. Elara hesitated for only a moment, her hand clutching the pendant at her neck, a reminder of the life she was fighting to return to. Then, with a final, steadying breath, she stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the swirling abyss. As Elara stepped through the shimmering gateway, the world around her dissolved into something beyond comprehension. Time itself seemed to stretch and twist, the air thick with a strange, almost electric hum. It was as though she had entered a place where the rules of reality no longer applied, a realm where dreams and memories collided. The ground beneath her feet shifted unpredictably, and the horizon seemed to fold in on itself, creating a disorienting kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. Her heart raced as fragmented visions began to materialize around her. Faces she knew all too well flickered in and out of focus, her crew, alive but trapped. They were caught in endless cycles, reliving their worst moments over and over. She saw Orion, his usual calm demeanor shattered as he struggled against an invisible force, his voice echoing a desperate plea for help. Lyra, the ship's medic, was frozen in a moment of failure, her hands trembling as she tried to save a patient she couldn't reach. Each scene was a haunting reminder of the pain they carried, the burdens they couldn't escape. Before she could reach out to them, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Elara, Kale's presence emerged from the mist, his form half solid, half ethereal. His voice was calm but urgent, his eyes piercing as they met hers. "This place isn't just a test of survival, it's a test of your mind. The mist feeds on doubt, on fear. It finds your weaknesses and amplifies them. If you want to save them, you'll have to face what you've been running from." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had always carried the weight of her past like an anchor, the memory of her first crew's demise a constant shadow, and now the mist seemed determined to drag her back to that moment. The scene unfolded before her once more, the ship's alarms blaring, the desperate scramble to evacuate, the faces of those she couldn't save. The guilt threatened to swallow her whole, as it had so many times before. But this time, something shifted. Elara clenched her fists, her breath steadying as she looked directly into the heart of the memory. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let you break me. I've carried this long enough." The weight of her words seemed to ripple through the air, and the vision began to crack. The faces of her lost crew didn't fade in sorrow this time, they smiled, as if releasing her from the burden she'd carried for so long. As the memory shattered, the realm itself seemed to respond. The chaotic swirl of colors and shapes began to stabilize, and in the distance, a light appeared, soft but steady, like a beacon calling her forward. Elara felt an undeniable pull, a sense that this light held the key to freeing her crew. With newfound resolve, she stepped toward it, her mind clearer than it had been in years. The mist had tested her, but she had faced it head on, and now the path ahead was waiting. Elara stepped forward, her boots sinking softly into the shifting ground as the light around her pulsed with an almost sentient rhythm. The air felt alive, humming with a low, resonant energy that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Ahead, the light coalesced into a towering figure, a being made of pure, shimmering energy, its form shifting and flowing like liquid starlight. It spoke without words, its voice echoing directly in her mind, deep and ancient, carrying the weight of countless eons. "I am the keeper of the mist," it intoned, its presence both awe-inspiring and unsettling. "You stand at the heart of the realm, where the veil between worlds grows thin. The mist is not merely a barrier, it is a test, a crucible for those who dare to cross its threshold. Few are found worthy to pass, and fewer still to leave." Elara's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not here to prove my worth. My crew, my family, is trapped here." "Release them." The keeper's form shimmered, its light dimming slightly as if considering her plea. "To free them, a balance must be maintained. The mist requires a guardian, a soul to anchor its power. One of you must remain, you or one of your crewmates. There is no other way." The words struck Elara like a physical blow. Sacrifice herself, or condemn one of her crew to an eternity in this place, lost to the mist forever. Her mind raced, searching for another path, another solution. She had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This wasn't a battle she could win with courage or cunning. It was a choice that would haunt her no matter what she decided, but Elara had never been one to accept defeat. "There's always another way," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil within. "I didn't come this far to leave anyone behind. If the mist is a test, then I'll find a way to pass it, on my terms." The keeper's light flickered, its tone shifting from solemn to something almost curious. "Your defiance is unexpected, but know this, the mist does not yield easily. To challenge its rules is to risk losing everything. Are you prepared to face the consequences?" Elara squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "I've already lost too much to turn back now. If there's a way to save my crew without sacrificing anyone, I'll find it. No matter what it takes." The air around her seemed to tremble, as if the realm itself were reacting to her words. The keeper's form wavered, its light dimming briefly before flaring brighter than before. "Then proceed, traveler, but remember, the mist sees all. It knows your heart, your fears, your deepest truths. To outwit it, you must first outwit yourself." With that, the keeper dissolved into a cascade of light, leaving Elara standing alone in the heart of the realm. The weight of its words lingered, pressing on her like a physical force. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also knew she wouldn't give up. Her crew was counting on her, and she would find a way to bring them home. No matter the cost. Elara stepped forward, her voice steady but tinged with defiance. "Your tests," she began, "are cruel and unjust. My crew never asked to enter this mist, never sought your trials. We are not here by choice, yet you punish us as if we were." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, as she locked eyes with the keeper. The swirling mist seemed to pause, as if listening, and for a moment, the silence was heavy with tension. The keeper tilted its head, its ethereal form shimmering with curiosity. "You challenge me, it said, its voice a low hum that resonated through the void. If you dare to question the mist's purpose, very well, I will grant you one final test. Solve the riddle of the gateway's symbols, and your crew may leave without sacrifice. Fail, and the mist will claim you all. Elara turned to the gateway, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns etched into its surface. The symbols seemed to shift and dance, a language older than time itself. She crouched low, her fingers brushing the cold stone as she studied the carvings. Each symbol told a story, a cycle of creation and destruction, of beginnings and endings. The more she looked, the more she understood. This was not just a riddle, it was a map, a key to the mist's very nature. Creation cannot exist without destruction, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. And destruction gives rise to creation. The gateway is not a barrier, it's a cycle. It can be reset. Her mind raced as she pieced together the puzzle. If she could align the symbols in the correct sequence, the gateway would open, allowing her crew to pass through while leaving the mist undisturbed. With careful precision, she began to rearrange the symbols, her hands moving with a confidence born of insight. The gateway hummed softly, its energy shifting as the symbols aligned. A faint light began to glow at its center, growing brighter with each passing second. Elara stepped back, her heart pounding, as the gateway's glow intensified, casting long shadows across the mist. The keeper watched in silence, its form shimmering with an unreadable expression. Finally it spoke. You have solved the riddle, traveler. Your wisdom is rare, and your courage rarer still. The mist will release your crew, but know this, it will not forget you. You have altered its balance, and such actions are not without consequence. Elara nodded, her face resolute. I understand, she said, but my crew's safety comes first. The mist may remember me, but I will face whatever comes. As the gateway's light reached its peak, the mist began to part, revealing a clear path beyond. Her crew stirred, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. Elara turned to the keeper one last time, her gaze unwavering. Thank you, she said, though the words felt inadequate. The keeper simply inclined its head, its form dissolving into the mist as the crew stepped through the gateway, leaving the enigmatic realm behind. But as they emerged into the vastness of space, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that the mist's gaze still lingered, watching, waiting. The keeper's warning echoed in her mind. The mist would not forget, and neither would she. Elara's hands moved swiftly across the control panels of the Eclipse, her fingers dancing over the glowing symbols that had once seemed so foreign. Each symbol now pulsed with meaning, guiding her as she recalibrated the ship's systems. The mist outside the viewport swirled chaotically, as if resisting her efforts, but she refused to falter. Every adjustment brought her closer to resetting the gateway, though the ship's AI chimed in with a stark warning. The recalibration process is unstable, it intoned, its voice steady but urgent. Continuing at this rate risks catastrophic failure of the vessel. Elara's jaw tightened as she weighed the options. There was no time for hesitation. With a decisive command, she initiated the jettison sequence for the cargo bay. The sound of metal groaning echoed through the ship as the bay detached, carrying with it precious supplies, food, equipment, and tools that might mean the difference between survival and disaster in deep space. but sacrifices had to be made. As the cargo bay drifted away, the mist began to thin, its oppressive weight lifting from the ship. The Eclipse stabilized, and the eerie silence that had gripped the vessel for so long was replaced by the soft hum of life support systems returning to normal. One by one, the crew stirred from their unnatural slumber. Kale was the first to awaken, his sharp eyes immediately finding Elara. She stood at the helm, her posture rigid but her hands trembling faintly. He could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her breath came in shallow bursts. "Elara," he began, his voice tinged with concern, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "We're not out of this yet," she said, her tone firm despite the weariness in her voice. "The crew's safety comes first. We need to make sure everyone is stable before we even think about what comes next." Kale nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. He knew better than to push her when she was in this state, focused, determined, and unwilling to show weakness. Still, he couldn't shake the worry that gnawed at him. The ordeal had taken its toll, not just on the ship, but on her. The symbols she had deciphered, the decisions she had made, the sacrifices she had endured, it all weighed heavily on her shoulders. Yet there she stood, refusing to let it show. As the rest of the crew began to awaken, the dim lights of the Eclipse seemed to brighten, casting a warm glow over the bridge. The mist was gone, but the journey ahead remained uncertain. Elara's resolve, however, was unwavering. She had brought them this far, and she would see them through whatever lay beyond. The crew gathered in the dimly lit common area of the ship, their faces pale but resolute. Elara stood at the center, her voice steady as she recounted the events of their recent encounter with the cosmic mist. She spoke of its strange, suffocating presence, how it seemed to seep into their minds, pulling at their deepest fears and doubts. But she carefully omitted the details of her own private confrontation, the eerie whispers of the Keeper, the visions it showed her, and the weight of its cryptic warning. Instead, she focused on the immediate danger, her tone firm as she urged the crew to remain alert. "The mist is unpredictable," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It's not just an environmental hazard, it's alive, in a way we can't fully understand, and it's still out there." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado replaced by a quiet determination. They had faced many dangers before, but this was different. The mist wasn't something they could outrun or outgun. It was a force that defied logic, something that seemed to thrive on their vulnerabilities. Still, they nodded in agreement, their resolve hardening. They had a mission to complete, and nothing, not even an ancient, sentient fog, was going to stop them. Later, as the others dispersed to their stations, Kale lingered behind. He approached Elara with a furrowed brow, his voice low but insistent. "You're holding something back," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I've known you long enough to tell when you're not being completely honest. What aren't you saying?" Elara hesitated, her defenses wavering under his steady gaze. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "The mist, it didn't just surround me, it spoke to me, it showed me things I can't explain. It felt like it was testing me, probing my mind, my memories, and now I can't shake the feeling that it's marked me somehow." She looked away, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I don't know what it wants, Kale, but I know it's not done with me." Kale placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. Whatever it is, you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. His words were meant to comfort, but Elara could sense the uncertainty beneath them. She nodded, forcing a small smile, but the weight of her encounter lingered like a shadow. The mist had gotten under her skin, and she couldn't shake the chilling thought that it was still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The ship hummed softly as it continued its journey through the void, the crew more united than ever, yet each carrying their own private fears. And somewhere, beyond the stars, the cosmic mist lingered, a silent, patient force biding its time. As the eclipse glided forward, the vast emptiness of space seemed to stretch endlessly around them, a silent void that offered no answers, but the calm was deceptive. Strange things began to happen, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. A flicker of light in a corridor where there shouldn't be one, a faint whisper caught in the hum of the engines. Then came the malfunctions. Systems that had run flawlessly for years began to glitch, screens flickering with static, navigation controls responding sluggishly as if resisting command. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in the ship's reliability wavering. It wasn't just the ship. Crew members started reporting things they couldn't explain. Shadows moving where no one stood, figures glimpsed out of the corner of an eye, vanishing the moment they turned to look. The atmosphere aboard the Eclipse shifted, tension thickening like a fog. Voices grew hushed, and paranoia began to take root. Was it fatigue, isolation, or something more sinister? Elara couldn't ignore it. The patterns were too consistent, too deliberate. She began her investigation, combing through the ship's systems, searching for any anomaly that might explain what was happening. That's when she saw it. Etched into the walls, faint but unmistakable, were the same symbols they had encountered in the mist. They pulsed faintly, as if alive, their glow growing stronger the closer she looked. Her heart sank. The mist hadn't just surrounded them, it had infiltrated the ship, weaving itself into its very structure. She called a meeting, her voice steady but urgent. "We're not just carrying cargo anymore," she told the crew. "The mist, it's here, in the walls, the systems, maybe even in us, and it's growing stronger." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Eyes darted to the walls, as if expecting the symbols to reveal themselves at any moment. Fear, once a distant shadow, now loomed large. Elara knew they couldn't wait. The mist's influence was spreading, feeding on their unease, their doubts. She tasked her team with isolating the affected systems, but every fix was temporary. The symbols always returned, more intricate, more invasive. Time was running out. If they didn't find a way to purge the mist's presence, it wouldn't just corrupt the ship, it would consume them all. The Eclipse was no longer just a vessel. It had become a battleground, and Elara was determined to win. But first, she would need to uncover the mist's true nature, and fast. As Elara and Kale stood in the dimly lit corridor, the weight of their discovery pressed heavily on them. The mist wasn't just a physical entity. It was alive, feeding on something far more intangible: fear. Every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed to pulse with its presence, as if it were watching, waiting. Kale's voice broke the silence, steady but urgent. If it thrives on fear, then we need to cut off its source. We have to help the crew resist it. Elara nodded, her mind racing. She knew what had to be done, but the thought of facing the crew, of revealing her own vulnerabilities, made her chest tighten. Still, she steeled herself. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about unity. Gathering the crew in the ship's central hub, Elara took a deep breath. The room was tense, the air thick with unease. She could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the fear. Some avoided her gaze entirely, their expressions clouded by the mist's influence. "We've all felt it," she began, her voice firm but gentle. "That creeping sense of dread, the way it seems to whisper in your mind, feeding on your darkest thoughts. But I need you to understand it's not just a threat. It's a predator, and it's using us against ourselves." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unignorable. Then she did something unexpected. She opened up, sharing the story of her encounter with the Keeper. How she had been paralyzed by fear, how it had nearly consumed her. "I thought I was strong enough to face anything," she admitted, her voice softening. "But in that moment, I wasn't. I let it in, and it changed me." The crew listened, their skepticism giving way to something else, recognition. One by one, they began to share their own struggles, their own fears. The mist had touched each of them in some way, and now, for the first time, they were confronting it together. As the stories unfolded, something remarkable happened. The symbols etched into the walls, once glowing faintly with an eerie light, began to fade. It was as if the mist itself was retreating, its grip loosening in the face of their collective resolve. Kale watched, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "It's working," he murmured, but Elara's expression remained cautious. She knew this wasn't the end. The mist wasn't gone, not truly. It had simply withdrawn, biding its time, waiting for the next moment of weakness. And in the vast emptiness of space, where isolation and uncertainty could creep in at any moment, that moment would come. For now, though, the crew stood united, their spirits bolstered by Elara's honesty and their shared determination. The battle wasn't over, but they had taken the first step. And that, Elara realized, was more than they had ever done before. The mist might still be out there, lurking in the shadows, but so were they, ready to fight, ready to resist, and ready to reclaim the light. The eclipse drifted silently through the void, its searchlights cutting through the darkness to reveal a haunting sight. A derelict ship loomed ahead, its hull pockmarked with age and decay, yet adorned with the same enigmatic symbols that had marked the mist. The sight sent a ripple of unease through the crew. Elara, ever the leader, wasted no time. She gathered a small team, her most trusted and capable, and prepared to board the forsaken vessel. Their mission was clear: uncover the truth behind the mist and its connection to this ghostly ship. As they crossed the threshold into the derelict's airlock, the air grew thick with tension. The interior was a maze of shadowy corridors and flickering lights, the remnants of a life long extinguished. The team moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the silence. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the ship's logs, stored in a dusty control room. The entries painted a grim picture, a crew driven to madness by the mist, their unity shattered as suspicion and fear took hold. The logs spoke of whispers in the dark, of paranoia that turned friend against friend, until the ship became a tomb, Elara's heart sank as she pieced together the story. The mist wasn't just a physical threat. It preyed on the mind, feeding on division and despair. She turned to her team, her voice steady but urgent. "We can't let this happen to us. We stay together, no matter what. Unity is our shield." But before they could act on her warning, the mist surged. It poured through the ship's vents, a suffocating wave of darkness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent will. The team scrambled, but the mist was relentless, twisting the corridors into a labyrinth and separating them. Elara found herself alone, the voices of her crewmates fading into the distance. Determined not to succumb, she pushed forward, her resolve hardening with every step. The mist whispered to her, conjuring doubts and fears, but she refused to listen. She thought of her team, their trust in her, and the bond they shared. That bond was her anchor, her weapon against the mist's manipulations. Navigating the ship's twisting passages, Elara called out to her crew, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. She knew time was against her. The mist would not stop until it had claimed them all. But she also knew this. As long as they stood together, they had a chance. And so, with each step, she fought not just for their survival, but for the unity that would see them through. The derelict ship was a graveyard, but Elara was determined it wouldn't become theirs. Elara's heart raced as she navigated the crumbling corridors of the derelict ship, the metallic groans of the structure echoing like a death rattle. She found her team trapped beneath a collapsed beam, their faces pale but determined. With a surge of adrenaline, she managed to free them, her hands trembling as she pulled the last of her crewmates to safety. But their relief was short-lived. The mist, once an eerie presence, now swirled and coalesced into a towering, monstrous entity, a shadowy figure with glowing, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through their very souls. It loomed before them, blocking their only path to escape. Elara stepped forward, her mind racing back to the Keeper's cryptic words. This wasn't just a battle of strength, it was a battle of will. The mist, she realized, was feeding off their fear, their doubts, their darkest thoughts. It wasn't just a physical threat, it was a mirror, reflecting the very things they feared most. She turned to her team, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "It's not real, not in the way we think. It's us, our fears. If we let it consume us, it wins. But if we stand together, if we refuse to give in, we can weaken it." Her words sparked something in the group. One by one, they straightened, their resolve hardening. The mist entity lashed out, its form shifting and distorting, as if trying to overwhelm them with visions of failure, loss, and despair. But Elara held her ground, her focus unbroken. She reached deep within herself, drawing on the knowledge the Keeper had imparted, the understanding that fear, no matter how powerful, could be faced and overcome. The team stood shoulder to shoulder, their collective strength forming a barrier against the entity's onslaught. As they refused to yield, the mist began to falter. Its form flickered, its once imposing presence shrinking under the weight of their unity. With a final surge of determination, Elara led the charge, guiding her team past the weakened entity and toward the exit. They barely made it back to the Eclipse before the derelict ship imploded, its twisted remains swallowed by the void. But as the airlock sealed behind them, a chilling realization settled over the crew. The mist hadn't been left behind. It was here, on their ship, its presence growing stronger, more insidious than ever. The victory felt hollow as the crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had escaped the collapsing ship, but the true battle was far from over. The mist was no longer just an external threat. It was within them, a reminder that their fears, if left unchecked, could still consume everything they held dear. The air aboard the Eclipse grew heavy, not just with the strange, shimmering mist that now seeped through the ship's corridors, but with something far more insidious: distrust. It started subtly, a whispered doubt here, a sidelong glance there. The mist seemed to amplify every insecurity, every buried resentment, until the crew began to turn on one another. Voices rose in heated arguments over trivial matters, and old grievances resurfaced with a venom that felt alien to the close-knit group. Elara could sense the shift, a fracture spreading through the unity she and Kale had worked so hard to maintain. Kale, ever the steady hand, moved through the chaos, trying to calm tempers and remind everyone of their shared mission. But even he struggled against the mist's influence. His words, usually so grounding, seemed to bounce off the growing walls of suspicion. Elara watched as the crew she once trusted began to splinter, their bonds fraying under the weight of the mist's manipulation. She knew they couldn't last like this. If the mist wasn't stopped, it wouldn't just divide them, it would destroy them. In a moment of clarity, Elara realized the mist wasn't just spreading through the ship. It was feeding off their discord, growing stronger with every argument, every moment of doubt. She called an emergency meeting in the command center, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't us," she said, her tone firm, but laced with urgency. "The mist is twisting our thoughts, turning us against each other. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything, not just the mission, but each other." Kale stood beside her, his presence a silent anchor. "We need to contain it," he added, his voice calm but resolute. "Before it's too late." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. They could feel the truth in his words, even through the fog of mist-induced paranoia. Elara's mind raced as she considered their options. The mist was spreading too quickly, and their usual methods of containment had failed. There was only one solution, a drastic measure that made her chest tighten with dread. She turned to Kale, her voice steady despite the weight of her decision. "We have to jettison the engines." The room fell silent. The engines were their lifeline, the only way to power the ship and chart a course back home. Without them, they'd be adrift, at the mercy of the void. But Elara knew it was the only way to sever the mist's hold. "It's the heart of the mist spread," she explained, her gaze sweeping over the crew. "If we cut it off, we cut off the mist, but it comes at a cost. We won't be able to return until we find another way." The crew hesitated, the gravity of the decision sinking in. But then, one by one, they nodded. They trusted her, they trusted each other, and in that moment, the mist's grip began to loosen, as if it sensed the unity rekindling among them. With a deep breath, Elara initiated the sequence. The ship shuddered as the engines detached, drifting away into the void. The mist, severed from its source, dissipated like smoke in the wind. But the silence that followed was heavy, the weight of their sacrifice settling over the crew. They were alive, yes, but the road ahead was uncertain. Elara stood at the helm, her hands gripping the console as she stared out at the endless expanse of stars. The cost of their survival weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she knew they'd made the only choice they could. And as the crew gathered around her, their resolve unshaken despite the challenges ahead, she felt a flicker of hope. They were adrift, but they were free. And together, they would find a way forward. The air inside the Eclipse was heavy with the scent of burnt circuits and the metallic tang of desperation. The mist was gone, but its aftermath lingered in the form of flickering lights, sparking panels, and the low groan of strained machinery. Elara stood in the dimly lit control room, her hands trembling as she assessed the damage. The ship's once pristine systems were now a patchwork of errors and warnings, each one a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Supplies were running dangerously low, rations were down to a handful of meals, and the water recyclers were barely functional. The weight of their situation pressed on her shoulders, and she couldn't shake the thought that it was her decisions that had brought them here. Kale stepped into the room, his presence steadying despite the chaos. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Elara, you're carrying too much blame. We all made choices, but yours saved us. That mist would have consumed us if it weren't for you. We're still here because of what you did." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of her guilt. She nodded, though the doubt still lingered in her chest. The crew, now bonded by their shared struggle, moved with a quiet determination. There was no time for despair, every second counted. Jackson, with his knack for engineering, rigged a makeshift power relay using scraps from the storage bay. Lyra, ever resourceful, recalibrated the life support systems with tools that were never meant for such delicate work. Even Zeke, usually reserved and distant, pitched in without complaint, his hands steady as he repaired the damaged navigation console. Together, they worked in harmony, their actions speaking louder than words. It was a testament to the unity that had allowed them to overcome the mist, and it gave Elara a flicker of hope. But hope was fragile, and she knew better than to let it blind her. The Eclipse was limping, and their journey was far from over. The repairs were temporary fixes at best, and the vastness of space stretched endlessly before them. As she watched her crew, their faces lit by the glow of welding sparks and the faint hum of repaired systems, she felt a quiet resolve settle within her. They had faced the impossible and survived. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The ship groaned again, a reminder of its frailty, but Elara's focus sharpened. She turned to Kale, her voice steady for the first time in hours. "We'll make it work. We've come this far, we're not giving up now." His smile was faint but genuine, a silent agreement that spoke volumes. The Eclipse might be battered, but its crew was unbroken, and in the vast, uncharted expanse of deep space, that was enough to keep them moving forward. The Eclipse drifted silently through the void, its engines sputtering as it limped toward the faint glow of a distant star system. The crew, weary from their long journey, barely had time to catch their breath before the mist returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the gentle, swirling haze they had encountered before. It was a raging tempest, a colossal storm of light and shadow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The mist surged toward the ship, its tendrils reaching out like claws, threatening to consume everything in its path. Panic spread through the crew, but Elara stood firm, her eyes locked on the approaching chaos. She had always been the one to see patterns where others saw chaos, to find meaning in the unknown, and now she saw something no one else could. The mist wasn't just a force of nature, it was alive. It was sentient, and it had chosen her. Elara's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of what she had learned. The Keeper's words echoed in her memory, a cryptic puzzle she had finally solved. The mist wasn't an enemy to be defeated. It was a consciousness seeking connection, a being that had existed long before the stars themselves. It had been misunderstood, feared, and driven into isolation. But now it had found her. Elara knew what she had to do. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. She spoke not in words, but in emotions, in images, in the language of the mist itself. She offered herself as a bridge, a vessel to carry the mist's essence, without allowing it to harm those she cared for. It was a gamble, a leap into the unknown, but Elara knew there was no other way. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if considering her offer. Then, with a surge of energy, the mist rushed toward her. It enveloped her, not with malice, but with a strange, shimmering warmth. Elara felt its power flood through her, not as a force to be controlled, but as a partnership, a merging of two beings into one. Her vision blurred, her senses expanded, and she felt the weight of the mist's ancient memories pressing against her mind. She saw galaxies being born, civilizations rising and falling, and the endless dance of time itself. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the storm dissipated. The mist was gone, absorbed into Elara, leaving the eclipse unharmed and the crew in stunned silence. But Elara was no longer the same. Her eyes glowed faintly with the mist's light, and she carried within her a power she barely understood. She could feel its presence, calm and watchful, a constant companion in her thoughts. The crew looked to her, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty. She smiled, a small, reassuring gesture, but inside, she knew her journey was far from over. The mist had chosen her for a reason, and its purpose was still unclear. But one thing was certain, Elara had stepped into a role she could never step back from. She was no longer just a navigator or a seeker of knowledge. She was something more, something that would forever change the course of her life, and perhaps the fate of the cosmos itself. The Eclipse glides silently into the star system, its hull scarred but intact, a testament to the trials endured by its crew. Around them, the vastness of space stretches endlessly, a canvas of light and shadow. For the first time, in what feels like an eternity, there's a moment to breathe, to heal. But the journey is far from over. Elara stands at the observation deck, her silhouette framed by the glow of distant stars. The mist, now a part of her, pulses faintly beneath her skin, an ever-present whisper of power and peril. She clenches her fists, trying to steady the storm within. It's a constant battle, one that threatens to erode the very essence of who she is. Kale finds her there, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. He doesn't need to ask what troubles her. He can see it in the way she stares into the void, her eyes reflecting the weight of her choices. "You're not alone in this," he says, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken promise. "We'll find a way to break the bond, to free you from its hold." Elara turns to him, gratitude and fear mingling in her gaze. She knows it won't be easy, but his faith in her is a spark of hope she clings to. The crew, though battered and weary, looks to Elara with a mix of awe and uncertainty. She's become more than their captain. She's a symbol of their survival, a beacon in the darkness. Yet, Elara feels the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. She knows she's not just fighting for herself and Amor, she's fighting for all of them. The mist may have saved them, but it's also a chain, binding her to a power she barely understands. Every step forward feels like a gamble, each decision a balance between control and surrender. As the crew begins the painstaking process of rebuilding their lives, Elara finds herself drawn back to the observation deck, her sanctuary amidst the chaos. She gazes out at the stars, their light a reminder of the infinite possibilities that lie ahead. The mist stirs within her, a restless force that both terrifies and fascinates her. It's a part of her now, for better or worse, and she knows she must learn to wield it, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of everyone who depends on her. In the quiet moments, when the hum of the ship fades into the background, Elara makes a silent vow. She will master the mist. She will harness its power, not as a weapon, but as a shield, a force to protect those she loves. The road ahead is uncertain, fraught with challenges she can't yet comprehend, but she's ready to face them. The stars, endless and uncharted, call to her, promising new horizons and untold adventures. And as the eclipse drifts further into the cosmos, Elara takes a deep breath, her resolve unshakable. The mist may have changed her, but it hasn't broken her. Not yet, and as long as she has her crew, her purpose, and the light of the stars to guide her, she knows she'll find her way.